The storm ended some time before dawn. Ruth Harper knew this because she woke to the silence of it. The specific silence that followed a serious storm, the quality of stillness that came after hours of wind and rain, the way a held breath came after exertion. She lay in the dark of the cabin and listened to the silence and felt it settle around her, the way the silence of aftermath always settled, with the particular weight of something that had spent itself and was done. She did not get up immediately. She lay still and listened to the silence and to the sound of her husband breathing beside her, and to the smaller sounds from the children's corner, the even breathing of her oldest, Thomas, 12, and the faint snuffle of her youngest, Clara, 7, who had always made that sound in sleep since she was an infant, a sound Ruth had listened for so many thousands of times that the hearing of it was indistinguishable from comfort. She lay still for a while. Then she got up. She, dressed in the dark by habit, the way a farm woman dressed when she did not want to disturb the household, and she went to the window and looked out. The valley was dark and still in the way of the Ozark hill country in the last hour before dawn. The shapes of things present but not yet detailed, the ridgeline to the north visible against the slightly less dark sky above it, the creek audible from somewhere in the low ground. The storm had moved through and left the valley in the way that storms left things, cleaner, quieter, the air carrying the particular freshness of rain-washed September. Everything looked as it should look. She stood at the window for a moment. Then she noticed that the chimney of the Aldred house was not smoking. The Aldred house was 40 yards east along the track, close enough that Ruth could see its chimney clearly, even in the pre-dawn dark when the chimney's smoke would have been visible as a slightly paler shape against the sky. Ruth Aldred, her neighbor of 6 years, was a woman who had her fire going before first light every morning of her life. This was not an exaggeration. Ruth Harper had never, in 6 years of neighboring, seen the Aldred chimney cold at dawn. It was cold now. Ruth Harper stood at her window and looked at the cold chimney of the Aldred house and felt the first version of the feeling she would carry for the rest of that morning. A feeling she could not have named then, and struggled to name afterward, a feeling that was not yet alarm and not quite unease, but was something that occupied the ground between them. A wrongness in the corner of the eye that had not yet moved to the center. She told herself, the storm perhaps did something to the fire. Wet wood, a draft that killed it. Ruth Aldred was perhaps sleeping later than usual, as people slept later after a storm-interrupted night. She told herself these things and stood at the window and watched the Aldred chimney for a while. No, smoke came. She went to wake her husband. James Harper was 41 years old in September of 1870 and had been in the valley for 8 years, long enough that the valley was not a new place to him, but a known one, with the specific character that a known place had, the character that accumulated through seasons and weather and the small events of daily life until the place was inseparable from the life lived in it. He had come from Tennessee with Ruth and the infant Thomas in 1862, drawn by the land that was available in the hill country after the disruptions of the war years, which had pushed people out and left the Ozark valleys with property that a man with some capital and the willingness to work hard country could acquire on terms that were not available in more settled places. He was not a man who had chosen this country for its ease. He had chosen it for its terms, which were, the land was hard, but it was his, and what he made of it was what it became, and no one was going to tell him otherwise. 8 years had made him a man of the valley in the way that 8 years of serious work made a person part of a place. He knew the Aldred family and the Pruitt family and the Gear family and the 7 other families that had settled along the creek through the 1860s, knew them in the specific way of people who had been each other's only resource through the particular difficulties that valley life produced. He had helped Caleb Pruitt build his barn in the wet spring of 1865. He had sat with the Gear family through the illness that took their youngest in the winter of 1867. He had borrowed and lent and traded and argued and made up the arguments in the way of people whose proximity made disagreement temporary and cooperation necessary. He was not easily alarmed. When Ruth came to him in the dark and told him about the Aldred chimney, he lay still for a moment, and then got up and dressed without the expression of a man who thought nothing of what he'd been told. He put on his coat. He took his rifle from its place by the door, not because he had a specific reason to, but because the coat and the rifle were his going outside equipment, and he put them on together the way a man put on his thinking in the morning, as a matter of course. He opened the cabin door and went out. The air was September after rain, cool and clean and carrying the smell of the creek and the wet timber on the ridge. The track was muddy from the night's rain. The sky was beginning to show the first gray of dawn above the eastern ridge. Not light yet, but the beginning of the process that would become light. He stood on his porch and looked east along the track toward the Aldred house. The chimney was cold. He looked west toward the Pruitt house, 300 yards in that direction. The chimney was cold. He turned and looked up and down the track in both directions, checking each chimney he could see in the pre-dawn gray, and what he found was the same at each one. Cold. Every one of them. He stood on his porch with his rifle and looked at the cold chimneys of the valley in the first gray light, and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, back through the door into the cabin, "Ruth, get the children up." He went to the Aldred house first, because it was nearest, and because Ruth Aldred was the person he would go to in most situations that required another person. The door was open. This was the second thing he noticed, the first being the chimney, which he had already established from the porch. The door of the Aldred house was standing open on a September morning after a serious storm, open in the way of a door that had not been closed rather than a door that had been left carelessly ajar. Standing open. The interior of the house dark beyond the doorway, the specific dark of an unlit interior in the early morning, no firelight, no lamp. He stood at the door and called Ruth Aldred's name. No answer. He called her husband's name, Owen Aldred, a quiet man of 50 who had been in the valley longer than anyone. No answer. He stepped inside. The house was cold. Not the cold of a house that had lost its fire hours ago. The deeper cold of a house that had not been heated, that had absorbed the night's temperature without the fire that should have been going. The hearth held ash from the previous evening's fire, raked and banked in Owen Aldred's habitual way, the way Owen always banked the fire for the night. But the fire had gone out in the night and had not been rebuilt. The table held the remains of the previous evening's supper, the plates not yet cleared, the cups still present. The chairs pushed back in the way of people who had risen from the table and had not yet returned to clear it. James looked at the table for a moment. He went through the house. He went to the bedroom. The bed had been slept in. The quilts were thrown back in the way of people who had gotten up quickly, not the careful folding of a morning rising, but the thrown-back quilts of people who had left the bed with some urgency. The Aldreds were not in their house. He went back outside and stood in the track and looked at the valley. In the growing light, he could see more of it now. The shapes of the other houses resolving from gray suggestion into specific structures, each one familiar, each one part of the landscape he had known for 8 years. He looked at each one in turn. Every door he could see was standing open. He stood in the muddy track in the early September morning, and looked at the open doors and felt the wrongness settle into him, the way cold settled into a room. Gradually, completely, with the quality of a thing that was going to be true, regardless of his response to it. He heard Ruth step behind him, and the children's voices asking questions in the way of children who could feel the quality of adult attention and knew something was not right. He turned. He said to Ruth, "Stay with the children," he said. "I'm going to check the other houses." What he found in the next hour, house by house along the track and in the properties set back from it, was a variation on the same account. The Pruitt house, door open, fire cold, bed slept in and abandoned, the table set for a breakfast that had not been made. Caleb Pruitt's boots by the door, his good boots, the ones he wore into the settlement when the occasion required. His everyday boots were gone. He had left in whatever he had on his feet. The Gear house, door open, fire cold. Martha Gear's sewing basket overturned on the floor beside her chair. The thread spilled out across the floorboards. The thimble rolled under the table. The specific disorder of a thing dropped rather than set down. Not a struggle. Nothing in the house suggested a struggle. The basket had been in her lap, perhaps, or on the arm of the chair, and she had risen, and it had fallen, and she had not stopped to pick it up. He stood in the Gear house for a while. He had been in this house many times. He knew where things were and how they were kept. He knew the specific way John Gear arranged his tools on the shelf by the door, sorted by size the way John always sorted them. The tools were there. He knew the cup that Martha kept on the table for her evening tea, the blue-glazed cup she had brought from Tennessee, and that was the single piece of crockery in the house that was not purely functional. The cup was there, on the table, half full of cold tea. Cold tea. Not a cup left to be washed later. A cup left mid-drink. He went to the next house. The Dawes house, the Farr house, the Hale house, the Sutton house, the Kimball house, each one the same in its essential facts. Fire cold, bed disturbed, door open. The signs of people who had been present and were not present now. What accumulated across the hour, house by house, was not a single dramatic discovery, but the specific weight of the same fact repeated in different rooms, with different details, each new version adding to the account without changing its shape. A valley of 11 families. 11 variations on the same morning. The same cold hearths and thrown-back quilts and open doors, the same objects set down mid-use. A knife beside an unfinished piece of work, a book left open on a chair, a child's wooden toy in the middle of a floor. The ordinary objects of ordinary evenings, present and abandoned, each one a kind of testimony, not to harm, to departure, to the specific shape of a life interrupted at a particular moment and left exactly as it was. He found at the Kimball house at the far end of the track something he had not found at the others. The Kimball children, there were 3, the oldest 10, the youngest perhaps 4. The Kimball children's beds had been slept in and abandoned the same as the parents. Whatever had taken the adults from the other houses had taken the children here. He stood in the Kimball children's room for a long time. He had been noting at each house whether there were signs of the children and had been constructing an account as he went. The Pruitt house had no children. Caleb and Mary Pruitt had no living children, a fact the valley held with the particular tender discretion that such facts were held. The Gear house had 2 children, both older, and their beds were the same as their parents. The Dawes house had 1 child. At every house with children, the children were gone the same as the adults. He stood in the Kimball children's room and looked at the small beds with their thrown-back quilts, and he did not move for a while. Then he went back out to the track. Ruth was waiting at their own porch with Thomas and Clara when he came back. She had read his face well enough in the years of their marriage to read it now. She saw what he had found before he said it. In the specific way she had of receiving difficult things, the way she received them without flinching and without looking away. He told her. He was brief and specific, and he did not add to the facts, which were already sufficient. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The livestock." He said, "I was going to ask you the same thing. The livestock were loose." This was what they found when they walked the valley together, leaving Thomas with Clara on the porch with specific instructions to stay there and stay inside if they heard anything. The animals that had been in barns and pens and pastures were loose, not panicked, not injured, not in the state of animals that had experienced a violent disruption. The animals of the valley were simply out. The gates open, the barn doors open, the fences in most cases intact. The animals had been let out rather than broken through. Someone had opened the doors and the gates before they left, or before whatever had happened had happened. Ruth said, "They fed the animals." James said, "They opened the enclosures. That's not the same as feeding them." Ruth said, "It means they had time, enough time to open the enclosures before they went. They weren't taken by surprise in the night." James said, "Or it means whoever opened the enclosures was trying to be certain the animals would survive." They stood in the Aldred yard, looking at Owen Aldred's 2 horses cropping at the wet September grass in the track, free and calm, and neither of them said what this implied about the state of mind of whoever had opened the gate. A person who opened the enclosures on their way out was a person who did not expect to come back. They looked for tracks. This was James's idea, and it was the right idea. The ground was wet from the night's rain, soft enough to hold impressions, and if 43 people had walked out of this valley in the hours before dawn, there should have been tracks in the mud of the track and the soft ground at the valley's edges. What he found was inconsistent and strange. There were tracks. Not on the main track. The track itself had been walked by him in the previous hour, and the mud held his own prints clearly. At the edges of the track, in the grass and the soft ground at the margins, there were impressions. Shoe prints, boot prints, the smaller prints of children's feet, moving in the direction of the North Ridge. Not organized, not a column of people walking in file. More like the movement of people who were all going the same direction without coordination, each in their own line, spread across the width of the valley floor. He followed these prints to the base of the North Ridge, where the valley floor met the timber. He stood at the timber's edge and looked at the ground and found the prints continuing into the trees, the soft forest floor holding them in the particular way of forest soil that had been rained on, the impressions clear and recent. He stood at the edge of the timber and looked into it. He did not go in. He stood there for a long time and looked into the timber and at the tracks continuing into it, and he felt something that he would not describe directly in the account he wrote, but that he described in its effects. His hands on the rifle, the specific quality of stillness that came over him, the sense of a threshold that was not merely physical. He turned and went back to his wife. He said, "They went north, into the timber on the ridge." Ruth said, "All of them." He said, "The tracks go that way. I don't know how far," she said. "Did you go in?" He looked at her. He said, "No." She received this without comment. She had been married to him long enough to know when his no was a practical decision and when it was something else. This was something else. She did not ask him to explain. She said, "Why didn't we hear anything?" He said, "What?" She said, 43 people left this valley in the night, children among them, in the middle of a storm. They opened enclosures and walked north into the timber, and they did not come back, and we heard nothing. We slept through it, he said. The storm, she said. Yes, the storm. She looked at the north ridge, at the dark line of the timber against the September sky. The storm was very loud last night, he said. Yes, she said. But James, children walking into timber in a storm at night, and we heard nothing. Not a voice, not a sound. We slept through all of it and heard nothing. James looked at the north ridge. He said, I know, she said. What kind of storm is loud enough that you don't hear children? He did not have an answer for this. They found the first account of the sound 3 days later, in the gear house. James had been going through the valley's houses in a systematic way, the way a man went through things that needed to be gone through regardless of what he found, looking for anything that would help him understand what had happened, looking for anything that would help him know whether to expect the people to come back, looking for anything at all that added to the account he was building. In the gear house, on the shelf above the cold hearth, he found John Gear's journal. John Gear was not a man James had thought of as a journal keeper. He was a practical farmer of 55 who had the particular quality of hill countrymen of his generation, the quality of doing rather than recording. But the journal was there, a worn, cloth-covered book of perhaps 100 pages, and James took it down and opened it, and found that John Gear had been keeping notes in it for at least 2 years. Brief notes, practical, the weather, the state of the crops, the health of the animals. The record of a man who had decided at some point that certain things were worth writing down. He found the entry for September 14th, the day before the storm. It said, "Wind from the north again this evening. Same as the last 3 nights. Martha says she hears something in it, but I told her it's only wind. I've heard nothing." He found the entry for September 15th. It said, "Storm coming. Banked the fire early." Martha heard it again, the thing in the wind. She woke me in the night. I lay and listened, and I heard it this time. Not certain what it is. Something in the upper register, almost not there, the way a sound was almost not there when it was at the edge of what you could hear. Martha said it reminded her of singing. I would not say singing. I would say it reminded me of something I have heard before and cannot place. I told her it was the wind over the ridge. She said it was not. That was the last entry. James sat in John Gear's chair and held John Gear's journal and read the last entry again. Then he sat still for a while. He thought about what Ruth had said. What kind of storm is loud enough that you don't hear children? He thought about his own sleep that night, which had been, now that he examined it, unusually deep. He was a light sleeper generally, a farm man's sleep, easily broken by sounds that required response, by the quality of quiet that meant weather was coming, by the various sounds of the night that a man with livestock and crops and a family's safety to monitor learned to remain half-present to even in sleep. He had slept through the storm completely, had not woken once until the silence woke him. He had no memory of the storm, no half-waking, no awareness of the wind or the rain, nothing. He had gone to sleep, and then he had woken in the silence, and that was all. He thought about the gear entry. Something in the upper register, almost not there. He thought, we did not hear it. He thought, whatever was in the wind on the night of September 15th, 1870, the Harper family did not hear it. He thought, and the Gear family did. He sat with this for a long time. Then he went to check the other houses for journals, for letters, for any account that any of his neighbors had left of what they had heard or seen in the days before the storm. He found 3 more accounts. At the Pruitt house, in the small desk that Caleb Pruitt kept in the corner of the main room, a letter that had been started and not finished, addressed to Caleb's brother in Tennessee. It said, "Something odd the past few days. A sound at night when the wind is from the north. Mary says she's been hearing it since Monday. I only heard it last night, just before the storm started. Don't know how to describe it well. Not like anything I know. But it makes me think of—" The letter ended there. The pen was on the desk beside the paper, as though set down mid-sentence and not picked up again. At the Dawes house, a notation on the back of a feed bill that Will Dawes had been using as a writing surface, a habit his wife had always complained about. The notation said, "3 nights running. Speaks in the wind. Reminds me of the sound the ridge makes sometimes, that harmonic in the stone when the weather is a certain way. But more deliberate. More deliberate." James read this twice. At the Farr house, he found nothing written, but he found something else. The Farr house had 3 children. The oldest, a girl of 15 named Anna, had a small shelf in her room with a few books. Among the books was a notebook with her name on the cover. He opened it to the last entry, which was dated September 15th, the day of the storm. Anna Farr had written, "I have been listening to it for 4 nights, and I think I understand what it is asking. I think it is asking us to come. I think it has been asking politely, and I think tonight, when the storm is here, it will ask differently. I am going to wake my parents." James sat on the edge of Anna Farr's bed and held the notebook and looked at the entry for a long time. He thought, she woke her parents. He thought, and then the storm came. He thought, and then they went. He did not sleep well for a long time after. Not from fear, not the active, present fear of a threat that might still be there. The threat, if it was a threat, had passed with the storm. The sound that John Gear had noted, and Caleb Pruitt had started a letter about, and Will Dawes had called deliberate, had come on the storm wind and had gone with it. And in the 3 weeks since the storm, the wind had been ordinary, and the nights had been silent, and nothing had come out of the timber on the north ridge. He did not sleep well because of what he knew. He knew that a sound had moved through the valley on 3 or 4 nights before the storm, a sound in the upper register, almost not there, carried on the north wind. He knew that his neighbors had heard it, and he had not. He knew that on the night of the storm, when the sound had apparently reached whatever it was building toward, 43 people had gotten up from their beds and opened their livestock enclosures and walked north into the timber in the dark and the rain. He knew that he and his wife and his 2 children had slept through all of it. He had been trying, in the weeks since, to understand what it meant that they had not heard it. The simplest explanation was that they had simply not been awake at the right moment, that the sound had come at an hour when the Harper family was sleeping deeply, and the other families had happened to be lighter in their sleep, or awake for their own reasons, or woken by their dogs, or their livestock, or some other ordinary trigger. But Anna Farr had been listening for 4 nights. Caleb Pruitt had heard it the night before the storm. John Gear had heard it, and had told his wife it was only wind before he heard it himself. These were people who had been awake and listening, and had found the sound. James Harper was a man who woke at small sounds and had not found it. Ruth, who slept lightly, and who had lain awake through portions of each of those nights. He knew this because she had told him afterward, had told him she'd been restless in the nights before the storm. Ruth had not heard it. He had formed a belief about this that he held privately for a long time before he told Ruth. He had formed the belief that the sound had not been available to them, not that they had missed it, that it had not been present for them in the way it had been present for the others. He had formed the belief that they had been, for a reason he could not know, excluded. He had formed the belief, and this was the one that made sleep difficult, that came to him in the dark in the weeks and months after, that he would never fully resolve, that being excluded was not the same as being spared. The county sheriff arrived in the first week of October, 3 weeks after the storm. He had come in response to a letter James had sent, carried out by James himself on horseback, a 2-day ride to the county seat that had required him to leave Ruth and the children alone in the valley for the first time since the morning after the storm. Ruth had told him to go. She had said, "We need people to know. We need this recorded somewhere." She was right, and he knew she was right, and he had gone, and the sheriff had come back with him, and the sheriff had spent 3 days in the valley going through the houses and looking at the tracks at the timber's edge and reading the accounts James had collected. The sheriff was a practical man who had been a sheriff for 15 years and who had dealt with things that didn't have easy explanations before. And he brought to this situation the specific quality of a practical man confronting something that exceeded his practical framework. Not denial, not the desperate application of ordinary explanations to extraordinary facts, but a steady and slightly hollowed attention. The attention of a man watching his framework fail and deciding what to do with the failure. He looked at the tracks at the timber's edge on the second day. He said, "You didn't go in." James said, "No." The sheriff looked at the timber for a while, said, "I'm going in." He went in alone over James's objection, and he came back after 2 hours and he was unchanged in any visible way. Not harmed, not distressed, but he was quiet for the rest of that day in a specific way. Not withdrawn, not uncommunicative. Quiet with the quality of a man who had found something that he was in the process of deciding how to report. In the evening, he told James what he had found. He said, "The tracks go north for about a mile, through the timber, up the slope. At a mile, the slope levels off onto the bench. You know the bench." James said, "I know it." He said, "At the bench, the tracks end." James said, "End." The sheriff said, "The ground on the bench is limestone mostly. Flat rock, doesn't hold tracks. The tracks come up the slope and come onto the bench, and then there's no more to follow." James said, "And beyond the bench?" He said, "More timber, more ridge. I went another half-mile north and found nothing. No camp, no fire, no evidence of 43 people spending any time anywhere." He paused. "I found one thing. On the bench, near the north edge. A child's shoe. Small, 4 or 5 years old, maybe." James said, "The Kimball youngest." The sheriff said, "I don't know. I brought it back." He set it on the table between them. He said, "I'm going to file a report. The report is going to say 43 persons are missing from this valley, and the investigation found no evidence of criminal action and no bodies, and the circumstances are beyond the current investigation's capacity to resolve." He looked at James. "That is the report I know how to write," James said, "and the sound." The sheriff looked at him. He said, "What would you have me put about the sound?" James said, "I don't know. I'm asking what you think it means." The sheriff was quiet for a long time. He said, "I think something called them. I think it called for several nights until enough of them had heard it to make the going critical. And then, on the night of the storm, it called in a way they couldn't not answer." He said, "I don't know what called them or why or where they went. I don't know why your family didn't hear it." He looked at the shoe on the table. I don't think I'm going to know those things, James said. Does that go in the report? He said no. That doesn't go in the report. Ruth Harper remained in the valley. This surprised people in the settlement to the south that was the nearest community and that received the account of the emptied valley, with the specific discomfort of people who wanted an explanation and were not going to get one. People asked why she stayed, and she gave different answers to different people, depending on what she thought the person was really asking. To the people who were asking whether she was afraid, she gave a plain answer: no, she was not afraid. To the people who were asking whether she was well, she gave a different plain answer: she was well, thank you. To the people who were asking whether she was waiting for the others to come back, she said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The truth of why she stayed was something she worked out across the first winter in the way that she worked out difficult things, by living inside them until they became clear, by giving them the time they needed, without hurrying the understanding. She stayed because they had been excluded, because something had moved through this valley and had passed over her family the way a flood passed over high ground, and she had not earned the exclusion and did not understand it, and felt, in some way she could not fully articulate, that leaving would be a further departure from the people who had not been excluded. That staying was the only form of loyalty available to her. That being in the valley where it had happened was the only way to remain present to the fact that it had happened. She had 43 neighbors, and they were gone. She stayed. James Harper ran the valley farm for 11 more years. He kept the records, maintained his own account, kept the journals and letters he had found in the empty houses, maintained the gear journal in particular as the document closest to a direct account of what the valley had heard. He sent copies of the most important documents to the county records office in 1875, with a letter explaining their provenance. The originals he kept. He wrote in his own account, which he expanded and revised across those 11 years, a passage that he returned to several times and never felt he had gotten right. I have tried to understand why we did not hear it. I have tried to understand this in every framework I have: practical, religious, philosophical, the particular framework of a man who has spent 11 years farming hard country and has learned to take the country on its own terms. None of these frameworks has given me a satisfying answer. What I have instead is this: I do not think we were spared. I think spare is the wrong word for what happened to us. A man who is spared has been saved from something, has been kept from a harm. I do not know that what happened to my neighbors was a harm. I do not know that it was a good. I do not know what it was, and I have spent 11 years in the valley where it happened, and I am no closer to knowing than I was the morning after the storm. What I know is that something in the wind on those September nights was speaking to this valley, to the people in it, or to some of the people in it, or to the valley itself through the people in it. And the people who heard it answered. They answered in the only way the answering was available, by going where the sound came from. And my family slept through it. I have tried to decide whether the sleeping was a mercy or a loss. I have not decided. He wrote, Clara asks me sometimes about the Kimball children, who were her friends when she was small, and whom she does not remember well, but remembers enough to ask about. I tell her that they went away. She asks where. I say, north, into the timber on the ridge. She asks if they will come back. I say I don't know. She seems to find this answer sufficient. Children sometimes found uncertainty more sufficient than adults did, because children had not yet been taught that uncertainty was something that needed to be resolved. He wrote, I think the valley knows what happened. I think the limestone ridge and the timber and the creek know what moved through here on that September night, and where it went, and what it wanted. I think the land holds this, the way it held everything, without explanation, without apology, as a fact of its own character that it owed no account of to the people who had come to live in it. He wrote, I have listened sometimes for the sound. In the evenings, when the wind comes from the north, I have stood on my porch and listened. I have never heard it. I have never known whether to be grateful for that or not. He wrote, The valley is quiet. The Harpers sold the property in 1881 and moved south to the settlement. Thomas Harper was a grown man by then and had his own reasons for leaving. Clara was 18 and had her own reasons. James and Ruth left the valley without ceremony. On a clear September morning, 11 years after the morning, Ruth had looked at the cold chimney of the Aldred house. James looked back once, from the road that climbed out of the valley to the south. He looked at the valley from the height of the road, the creek, the bottomland, the houses of his absent neighbors standing empty in the morning light, their doors all standing open still, as they had stood for 11 years, because James had opened them each spring when he walked the valley and had never closed them. He did not know why he had done this. He had not examined the impulse. He had opened them every spring and left them open, and now he was looking at them from the road, and they were open in the morning light, and the valley was quiet, and the timber on the north ridge was the timber it had always been. He looked at it for a moment. Then he faced the road and did not look back again. The valley has a name on a county map. The houses that were there in 1870 are gone. Time and weather and the particular entropy of unoccupied structures in hard country had taken them across the decades, and what was built after was different and newer, and had no memory of what had stood before. People have been in and out of that valley since the Harpers left. People have farmed it in varying degrees of seriousness across the generations. People have lived there without knowing what James Harper knew about it, which is most of the history of most places, the history that is present in the ground without being present in the knowledge of the people walking on it. On certain nights in September, when the wind comes from the north and carries the specific quality of Ozark September air in it, the cooling of the evening, the smell of limestone and late timber, people in the valley notice something they do not have words for. Not a sound, exactly. Something at the edge. Something in the upper register that is almost not there and is noticed most clearly when it is not being listened for. Most people turn their heads. Most people listen, and it is gone. James Harper wrote in the final revision of his account, I have come to believe that the sound was not malicious. I have come to believe this not because I have evidence for it, but because I have had 11 years to sit with the alternative, and it does not hold. A malicious sound would have taken everyone. It would not have spent 3 nights asking politely before it asked differently. It would not have given people time to open their livestock enclosures, to set things down, to rise from their beds without violence, and walk in an orderly way through the dark, toward a timber in the north. These were not the actions of people who were being taken against their will. These were the actions of people who had heard something and had decided, each in their own way, to answer it. He wrote, I do not know if that makes it better. He wrote, I think it makes it true. But in the morning they find sometimes that the night has passed differently than they expected, deeper, less troubled, more complete than the ordinary nights around it. They wake to the silence after the north wind and feel they have been somewhere, or that something has been near. They do not remember anything specific. They cannot say what woke them. They cannot say with certainty that anything did. They go about their mornings. The valley holds its quiet. The North Ridge holds its timber. And somewhere in the record of a night in September 1870, in the Gear Journal, in Caleb Pruitt's unfinished letter, in Anna Farr's notebook and her last certain sentence, the sound is still there, carried in the only medium that has kept it. Not the wind. The words of people who heard it and tried to say what it was and could not, and said so. The record of the trying. That is what remains.